This video is about how Puritans opposed Elizabeth and about how she dealt with them. If you haven't watched the other one that talks about who Puritans were and what they believed, then please watch that one first. So firstly, we're going to think about how Puritans opposed Elizabeth. We're going to come back to that alliteration, the use of P words here. Puritans wanted to purify Protestantism. So how were they going to do this? And how did that threaten the Queen? Well, the first thing that they did was something called prophesying, which is basically preaching, making sermons or speeches in meetings, and lots of people would gather round to listen. So that was seen by Elizabeth as something that threatened her power and authority, because they weren't really meeting in Church of England churches like she wanted. They were just meeting in public, making these speeches, these prophecies, preaching about Puritanism. And in doing that, they're questioning the changes that she's made to the Church of England. So that's the first thing, prophesying. Another way that Puritans opposed Elizabeth was through Parliament. So Peter Wentworth was an MP, and he used his position in Parliament to make a speech attacking Elizabeth and her changes to religion. So she saw that as a big threat, because remember, she can control Parliament, and if she's got somebody in Parliament, an MP like Peter Wentworth, opposing her in Parliament publicly, that's going to make her very annoyed. Another thing that Puritans did was produce pamphlets. So pamphlets being little leaflets. There'd been an increase in printing presses, so you could actually print pamphlets relatively cheaply, which means that you can distribute these quite easily, and lots of people can read them and see what they're saying. So a man called Stubbs made a pamphlet about Puritanism that Elizabeth was particularly annoyed about. We're going to see what happened to him shortly. And some Puritans in the 1590s even went as far as setting up their new separatist church, different from the Church of England. Now that was a big threat to Elizabeth's religious settlement by setting up a new Protestant church. That's a huge criticism of the Queen. So really use those P words to think about Puritans presenting power problems, because at the heart of all of the opposition that Puritans are providing for Elizabeth is that idea of power. They are opposing her power when they oppose her religious settlement over Protestantism. So what's Elizabeth going to do to respond to the threat posed by Puritans? Well, the first thing is that she's going to use her power, and the power that she has over the church is through the archbishops. So they are in charge of the Church of England in terms of its day-to-day running. Obviously, she has the title Supreme Governor, so she has overall control, but it's the archbishops that actually kind of do things on a day-to-day basis to control what happens. So there's three archbishops that we need to know about, but one in particular. The first one was Parker, and he published some rules. They didn't really do very much. He didn't have a lot of success in controlling Puritans at all, and he dies in office. His replacement is Grindal, and Grindal actually quite likes the prophesying and has some sympathy with the Puritans, so he actually just refuses to obey Elizabeth. So she suspends him and puts him under house arrest until he dies. So he's like imprisoned in his own house. But the archbishop that we absolutely need to know about is Whitgift. And Whitgift has a campaign of attack against Puritans. So he is quite strict and introduces lots of ways of controlling Puritans to reduce the threat that they posed. So priests could be suspended if they don't obey the Church of England rules, and 200 to 300 priests were suspended over their Puritan sympathies and their rules that they didn't follow. There were also fines called recusancy fines if people didn't attend the Church of England services. So these were for ordinary people who wanted to obey Puritans. And there are punishments introduced for printers if they produce the Puritan pamphlets. You can see how many P words there are right the way through this. So the other thing that Elizabeth did to respond to the Puritan threat was punishments, another P word. So Peter Wentworth, the one that made a speech in Parliament criticising her and supporting Puritanism, he's put in prison, so she imprisons Peter Wentworth. Stubbs, he's the one that made pamphlets, distributed them, supporting Puritanism. She has his hands cut off for making these pamphlets. A man called John Field, who was quite a high-profile Puritan who was good at prophesying. He was banned from preaching and prophesying. Grindal, the archbishop that we mentioned on the previous slide, he was suspended and put under house arrest because he wouldn't implement the orders that she wanted. And Barrow and Greenwood, they're the two men that set up the new separatist Puritan church in 1593. They're hanged for doing this. So there are really strict punishments that Elizabeth introduces for anybody that opposes her over Puritanism. So finally, we just need to consider how much of a threat Puritans actually were to Elizabeth. Well, firstly, they threaten her power. They're not really threatening her life. There aren't the plots from Puritans that there were from Catholics. But her response shows that she does see them as quite a serious threat. You don't imprison people, hang them or cut their hands off if you don't think that their views are threatening to you. Whitgift, the Archbishop, the third Archbishop, his campaign against them does break down their organisation, and when they're less organised, they're less of a threat. So she is quite successful in how she deals with that threat from them. But there are some really powerful Puritans who keep their views to themselves. They don't particularly act as a threat to her, and they actually stay in key positions. So people like Dudley or Walsingham, who was her spy master and uncovered the Catholic plots, he was a Puritan, but they still stayed in their jobs. They just weren't particularly vocal about their Puritan beliefs. The separatist Puritans, the ones that wanted to create their own church and did in 1593, they're a much bigger threat, but they're dealt with really effectively by the Queen in terms of getting rid of them. And the majority of Puritans were quite moderate. They actually want to be within the Church of England and just maybe make some reforms within it. So the final question then is, does Elizabeth overestimate the threat that they posed? That's really up to you to decide from the evidence that you've seen. They're certainly not as much of a threat as the Catholics were during her reign, and the Catholic plots to replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, were the biggest religious threats to Elizabeth throughout her reign.